So my book focuses on like the use of technology and surveillance by the government. So a thing that a government entity, whether it's your police department or the FBI or whatever, is doing to Americans. Right. So the Fourth Amendment, as I'm sure people know, right, protects again the right to unreasonable search and seizure. The key question is unreasonable, right? The Constitution doesn't say the government can never search you. It says the government cannot do it unreasonably. So typically the way we define what is or is not unreasonable is we have this thing that we call a search warrant or a seizure warrant, right? So it says, hey, Judge, we, the Oakland Police Department, think that Cyrus Farivar has stolen washing machines, and we think that those washing machines are in his house. And so here's why we think that, because we saw him unloading a bunch of washing machines off a truck and put them into his house. And so we want permission, Judge, to go search his house. And the judge says, yep, that sounds great to me. Go ahead and go do that. And then the police have permission. They have, they can conduct a reasonable search of my house. The warrant describes the things to be searched, the places to be searched, and the things to be seized, right? It has to describe with particularity where and what and why the police think that they're going to find the thing that they're looking for, right? So if they're looking for washing machines, they're not supposed to then also go open my dresser drawer, which could not contain a washing machine, and find, stacks of cash or whatever else that is in, my dresser drawer or whatever, like there are rules about, how things are supposed to be searched and the manner in which they're supposed to be done. But then it gets weird when we enter, and I describe some of these cases in my book, it gets weird when the government wants to use a tool to maybe, again, depending on your view, skirt the rules a little bit or be aggressive in prosecuting criminal suspects. So there's a case that I write about called Kylo, Kyllo, which involves a guy in Oregon who the police believed was growing marijuana in his house. And the way that they eventually figured out that he was, or the way that they confirmed their suspicions, was they took an infrared scanning device, they stood on the street outside of his house, and they pointed it at his house to figure out what is the thermal reading, what energy is, invisible infrared energy is being given off by the grow lamps in his house that could be picked up by this device. And they didn't have a warrant for that. And the police argued that they didn't need a warrant because they were not in the house. They were out on the street. And they had a device that could effectively peer through the wall of this guy's house and figure out whether he had something that was giving off massive amounts of infrared heat. And it turned out he was. But ultimately, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't, if you're going to use a tool like this, particularly when you're invading, peering through the walls, you can't, you need a warrant to do this. And this is sort of the, and one of the principles that they came back to is a constitutional principle or a Supreme Court precedent, I should say, that's known as the reasonable expectation of privacy. So you mentioned this case called Katz versus United States, which is a really interesting story. And reasonable expectation of privacy, I think, is one of these phrases, like that I think many of us have heard, but maybe we don't totally know what it means or where it came from or why it exists. It's like separate but equal. It's like one of these like weird legalistic phrases. So reasonable expectation of privacy means that it's a phrase that comes from this case, the Katz case, which involves a guy in Los Angeles in the 1960s who liked to gamble. And the way he would conduct his gambling would be that he would walk down Sunset Boulevard and he would go to payphones, right? Imagine a big, tall Superman-style payphone. And he would go into these payphones and he would call his bookie and he would place bets on college sports. And that's what he'd like to do. And he did this so much that he drew the attention of the LAPD and of the FBI. And eventually what they decided to do was to capture the sound of his making these phone calls but they didn't wiretap the phone. They didn't like do a kind of a technological trick to the phone itself. What they did was they placed microphones on top of the phone booths that he used, which is kind of amazing, actually. Like, and I'm imagining, like, I don't have any pictures of this, but what I imagine is like, right? Okay, so you've got a phone booth that's like taller than a person. So it's pretty tall, right? It's probably like, I don't know, 6.5, 7 feet tall at least, maybe bigger. And we're talking about 1960s technology. So I'm imagining these like gigantic reels of like tape, right? Like of actual like cellophane audio tape, right? These huge things that are mounted somehow on the top of the phone booth. And they had a team of agents who was watching him as he would walk from his apartment to these phone booths that he liked to use. And they would send a guy ahead and climb up the phone booth and presumably hit record because they were only interested in this one guy. They weren't interested in recording everybody. But that's just like, I just find that scene like so amazing that like a team of agents is like sending somebody, like they're probably, like I imagine that they're in like, this is like the 60s, so they're probably not in like Dick Tracy fedoras, but like, you know, I'm imagining like something like that. Like, anyway.
Yes.
So they capture this guy making these calls. And the argument that his attorneys made in his case that eventually, as you say, went to the Supreme Court was, hey, a person has a, quote, reasonable expectation of privacy in a phone booth like you would have in your home, like you would have in your doctor's office, like you would have in a hotel room, like you would have in a taxi. There are places that we all go to, that we all live in, that where our rights are sort of at their highest, where like the government has to clear a pretty high bar to get a warrant to cross that line. And so this is where this principle comes from. But then the question is like, okay, we have a reasonable expectation of privacy in our home. Do we have it in public? The Supreme Court says no, you don't. Which is why we were talking about license plate readers earlier, right? The reason why license plate readers can even exist, legally speaking, in this country is because the Supreme Court said in 1982, the year I was born, before license plate readers even existed, that there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in public.